The 1950s, when cars got longer, lower, and significantly more powerful. Oh, and there were fins. Actually, even though Cadillac started doing tail fins in 1948 as a styling trend, they didn't really catch on until the late 50s. In fact, the styling of the early 50s was very conservative. Brands that had rushed to come up with the more modern look in the late 40s were not doing as well as the brands that had moved forward at a slower pace, doing away with front fenders and keeping the rear fender look. In fact, some companies like Ford and Packard backtracked and added the look of rear fenders on their early 50s models. And one of the reasons for doing this is in a strong market, the more conservatively styled cars tend to be doing better. The GM and Chrysler products, for example, were very conservative for the period. But it was a booming market. The major manufacturers or the major brands were back over 1 million units a year, with Chevrolet dominating, being the number one seller every year but 57. Ford remained in a close second, with Plymouth following up with it in a distant third. Not only was Chevrolet consistently the best-selling brand, but starting in 1950, Cadillac had been the best-selling luxury brand. Part of this was due to new marketing aimed specifically at minorities, including women, which was a relatively new concept among premium brands. But this proved effective, and they quickly surpassed Packard. And GM's middle divisions were typically outselling most independent brands. In fact, the big three were dominating so much that they were looking at expanding. Lincoln had moved down market after the war in an attempt to be more profitable, but as profits were rising, they created the Continental division to fit above Lincoln to take some of that higher-end sales that they lost by moving Lincoln down market. They were also moving Mercury up market, which created a bigger gap between Ford and Mercury and allowed them to create the Edsel division. Chrysler broke Imperial off as a separate division to compete more directly with Lincoln and Cadillac. Kaiser created a small car division called Henry J., and there was even talk of Clipper separating from Packard as a lower-end division. Better fuels also meant that manufacturers could take advantage of higher compression, and overhead valve engines were becoming commonplace. This wasn't new technology. In fact, Buick had been doing overhead valves since the beginning, and even overhead cam had been around for decades. But the cheaper and simpler flathead design didn't allow for higher compression. And in emerging horsepower war, higher compression was necessary to stay competitive. And the horsepower war of the 50s was one of the fastest advancing horsepower wars in automotive history. To kind of put this into perspective, in 1950, a V8 Ford had about 100 horsepower. The bigger version of the same engine in the Lincoln had about 145. And the top-end luxury cars were somewhere around 160, 165. By 1955, Chrysler was essentially declaring itself as the winner of the horsepower war, so much so that they named a model after their horsepower rating, the new Chrysler 300, essentially double what Chryslers were pushing just 5 years before. And this was a one-year number because the 1956 Chrysler 300B had bumped that up to 345. And both Ford and Chrysler would offer 400 horsepower before the end of the decade. These fast-paced developments in technology and the dominance of GM meant that the independent manufacturers were struggling. What this meant was a series of mergers and buyouts among the independents to try to stay competitive. Nash and Hudson merged in 1954. Studebaker became part of Hudson the same year, and at the beginning of the decade, Kaiser took over Willys. Under Kaiser, Willys actually started producing cars again, at least for a few years. And by 1955, any American manufacturer that couldn't offer both an overhead valve V8 and an automatic transmission weren't around to complain about it in 1956. And the recession that came at the end of the decade impacted brands even harder. Soon Nash and Hudson would be merged into a single brand called Rambler. The once dominant Packard luxury car would be discontinued to focus more on the higher-selling Studebakers, and Packards would be replaced at Studebaker dealerships by Mercedes-Benz. Kaiser would pull out of the U.S. completely, moving to Brazil, leaving Willys to struggle on manufacturing Jeeps till the end of the decade. And Kaiser went from being known as the post-war wonder to the post-war blunder. And the big three would be impacted as well. Edsel would only survive for 3 years. Continental would be merged back into Lincoln just after the end of the decade. And rumors that DeSoto was going away eventually became true in the early 60s. The big change in the American market, however, was the increase in non-standard models by American manufacturers. And by non-standard cars, what I mean is, up until this point, most manufacturers essentially offered one car. It came in a variety of styles, shapes, lengths, but the design and styling was essentially all of the same. And different models at the time were what we would refer to now as trim levels. But some manufacturers started offering a second model that was distinct from all of the other models. And this is why, when you say a 57 Chevy, what they mean is a standard 57 Chevy, because if you meant a non-standard 57 Chevy, you would have just said Corvette. Because otherwise, whether referring to a 150, a 210, or a Bel Air, they're all essentially the same car. In some cases, this meant smaller cars, like the Nash Rambler and the Hudson Jet and the Kaiser Henry J, which even became available through the Sears catalog as the Allstate. But the real focus on new models came in the area of sports cars. It said that part of this came about from soldiers returning from Europe during the war being exposed to them and wanting them once they were home. Cars like Jaguar and Porsche and Mercedes and Alfa Romeo, and of course the Miata of the time, MG. And different manufacturers tried to appeal to this market in different ways. Most, of course, just tried to put sports car bodies on their existing technology. Chevrolet, for example, took their standard straight six, beefed up the compression, added multiple carbs, a high-performance cam, dual exhaust, threw a fiberglass body over it with a two-speed transmission, two-speed automatic transmission, and it became the Corvette, which was almost a flop until they upgraded to a V8 and a manual transmission in 1955. Kaiser did something similar to create the Kaiser Darrin. Nash sought the help of European manufacturers to create the Nash Healey. Then you had some new independent manufacturers trying to break into the sports car market, like Curtis Craft, which became Muntz, and of course Cunningham. Both of these companies used power plants from existing American luxury manufacturers, Cadillac, Chrysler, Lincoln. Then, of course, there was the Ford Thunderbird, although Ford insisted that the original Thunderbird was not a sports car and was a personal luxury car, although typically the personal luxury car of the period was a standard and was a much bigger car. And the later Thunderbirds from 58 on fit this market segment significantly better. And then there was the Studebaker Hawk. When Studebaker restyled in the early 50s with a longer, sleeker look, it was maybe just a little too far ahead of its time. And by the mid-50s, when a new Studebaker came out that was more conservative and more competitive, they didn't get rid of the sleeker body. They added some fins, a European-style grille, got rid of the sedan and station wagon versions, slapped an optional turbocharger in it, and had the new Hawk. Of course, this was more of a grand touring car than a sports car because it was originally designed to be a family car, so it had a functional back seat. There was even a limited run of Packard versions that had an even bigger V8 in them. And of course, there were the personal luxury cars of the period. Some people referred to these early cars as America's failed attempts at entering the sports car market with cars that were too big and heavy to be sports cars. But really, they were just standard cars from various manufacturers that had more style, more glitz, often were convertible, and you could pay significantly more money for them. These would be cars like the original Buick Skylark, the Packard Caribbean, the Cadillac Eldorado, the Continental Mark II, and of course the Thunderbirds, whether you count the earlier ones or not. And some may also include the Chrysler 300. Towards the end of the decade, fins came on strong. In fact, companies were struggling to add fins by 1956, to the point that some were actually just bolting metal fins onto the back of their existing designs. And with each redesign, fins became more prominent. In 1957, Chrysler went forward look, a longer, lower, wider car with huge fins. After being considered too conservative during the early 50s, this was an attempt to leap ahead of their competitors, and Plymouth even marketed the 57 model by saying, "Suddenly it's 1960." And they even went so far as to say that the fins had been wind tunnel tested to prove high-speed stability in a straight line. So I guess to some degree this could be considered the forerunner to the wing. When it came to fin dominance, nobody surpassed Cadillac. Nobody's tail fins were bigger or pointier or more decorative than Cadillac's. And the Europeans weren't exempt from this trend. A single large fin behind the driver became a trend on European race cars. And they started showing up on show cars, like the Alfa Romeo Bat show cars. And even Mercedes would eventually get into tail fins on production models. And on US models, fins would carry well into the early 60s. In fact, there's some debate as to what year Cadillac actually stopped doing fins, if they ever really did. But there was also another styling trend that came about in the late 1950s, the quad headlight. Although this started showing up in 1957, it wasn't 50-state legal until 1958. And in 1958, virtually every American car switched to quad headlights, something that would become expected on large American cars indefinitely. By the end of the 1950s, American cars had gotten huge, and as the market was no longer booming, the need for smaller, cheaper cars was starting to once again become a thing. But instead of the cars beginning to shrink, there was an explosion of all new non-standard models. And we'll come back to that in the 1960s.